Peter Arnade is a professor of history at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. In his spare time, he likes to take long walks and relax as the Dean of the College of Arts, Languages, and Letters at UH Mānoa. His specialty is late medieval and early modern Europe history, but with a very distinctive series of twists, born out of his family genealogy and his training in comparative history, with an emphasis on the political, cultural, and social. His past work includes deep dives into Burgundian ceremony and civic life in late medieval Ghent, the political culture of the Dutch Revolt, and work of great interest to those of us interested in life writing, pardon letters in the Burgundian Low Countries. In the early days of COVID, literally 6 weeks after the March 20th shutdown, Peter was doing a Zoom lecture on the Black Death and the invention of public health, a historical event with eerie echoes of the present, including controversies over quarantine, anti-Semitism, scapegoating, and competing theories of disease. And I'd also like to add that as Dean, Peter shows up. I saw him at opening night for the Hanakeaka Olelo Hawaiʻi Puana. Final weekend, everybody go. But then I see him at all the opening nights, and frequently at talks, presentations, exhibits, etc., etc., etc. And I also know that as a lifelong learner, he has also, to the extent that he can, been taking classes from the faculty in his own college. In short, as Dean, his research is not just a memory, a very good quality for a historian. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Arnade.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very, very kind and generous introduction. Thanks to all of you. Everybody's very busy. It was a very busy semester. I appreciate you taking time at lunch to come here about something kind of out of left field. Let me explain to you why I'm giving this talk and the origins of it. This is not my area of training or specialty. I'm trained in kind of straight up European history. But over the last decade, after moving here 12 years ago, my interest, part of the reason I moved here was my interest was beginning to shift more towards global and comparative issues. So I've been dabbling in kind of Dutch empire matters, Dutch colonial matters. And out of the blue, I got an invitation to go to New York last year to give a paper on this topic. So it was selected for me. Somebody heard I had done some work on this particular figure, and it was a conference on Dutch colonialism and the slave trade. This was not a paper about the slave trade, however. And so I was an outlier there. I was not one of the great experts in the subject. I'm not by training a colonial historian, but I was able to participate in this conference. What struck me about this conference in New York was twofold. It was held at the Schaumburg Center in Harlem the first day, and at the New York Historical Society in New York at the second day. Now understand, Dutch colonialism includes New York itself, right? Which used to be New Amsterdam. I was unprepared for the hundreds of people who showed up in this conference. I mean, hundreds of people. Most of them not academics. Most of them from the larger Afro-Caribbean community, from the Dutch and Caribbean diaspora. And it was just stunning to me, the level of community interest, maybe the kind that you see here around Hawaiian issues, but I was wholly unprepared for the turnout. And so what I was able to do was write a longer paper in very, very draft form, because my collaborator in this project will be Elizabeth Caldwell, who is an Atlantic world historian and knows a lot more about this. So this contribution of mine today is only partial. We plan a big rewrite of this paper, collaborative between the two of us, and she'll bring expertise around slavery and Atlantic world history that I'm familiar with, but that is not my area of expertise. The other interest of this for me is I was a child in West Africa. I went to, part of my elementary school was in West Africa, and I went to an African elementary. I did not go to an international school. I went to a local African elementary school, and my mother at the time, who was still very church-going, took me to an African Christian church for 2 years. And so I came of age, actually had my first communion as a Catholic. My mother raised me Catholic. My father's Jewish, but my brother raised me Catholic. I had my first communion at a West African Christian Catholic church in Ife, Nigeria. So I had long been interested in looping back to West Africa. I am by training a historian of the Low Countries, or what is today Netherlands and Belgium. This is the least studied of all the major European empires and colonial powers. So you often see the concentration on the French and the Spanish, but the Portuguese and Dutch were significant colonial and imperial powers. The least studied of the major European political powers are the Dutch. And we know their importance here in the Asia Pacific because they dominated in the 17th and 18th century, whether it's Japan, Taiwan, Batavia, or what is today Jakarta. We know the power of Dutch colonial power in the Pacific. It's less well known in the Atlantic. But if you don't know that this is the United Provinces or the Low Countries in the pre-modern period, gained its independence from Spain in 1648 after an 80-year war, and the war was fought through a lot of visual propaganda. So this is one of my favorite prints from the Dutch revolt against Spain from the early late 16th century. This is, get out of my garden. This is called the Dutch garden. Get out of my garden, Spanish pigs. Where the Spanish are depicted as copulating swine. There's some intimations of anti-Semitism here too, but there's a whole lot of going on here. But this is the United Provinces. Once they gained their independence, they went heavily into colonial competition in the Atlantic and the Pacific. They are the only European power that at once began to build an empire while they were simultaneously fighting an internal empire, the Spanish Empire, for their own republican liberty. So it's an interesting thing, is as the Dutch were building a world empire, they were also fighting for their independence against the Habsburg Spanish. So that's the background of this. This is the Dutch West and East Indies companies, which were the main vehicles of Dutch imperialism. The Dutch East Indies Company was, of course, for the Asia Pacific, and the Dutch West Indies Company was for the Atlantic world, which included West Africa itself. These are two famous joint stock trading companies that are very, very important in the history of colonialism. This is the area I'm going to be talking about other than the Netherlands. This is West Africa. We're going to be looking in particular at the Gold Coast of West Africa, what is today the heartland of which is Ghana, the modern nation state of Ghana. This is an early modern map of the Gold Coast. And you can see in this period there were 19 European trading forts on the west coast, on the west Gold Coast of Ghana. They did not settle. This was not settler colonialism. They did not bring European inhabitants to settle there, other than in these coastal communities. And these forts were staffed by a variety of different, soldiers and administrators and seamen and others, international proletariat who worked these trading companies. You had the Dutch West Indies Company bringing slaves and to the Caribbean and to Latin America, and then you had the English 8 miles north of Elmina. You had the English with their operation, and then you had a very little known part of kind of European colonialism, the Swedish and the Norwegians also doing the same, all in what is today Ghana. Okay, this is a figure I'm going to talk about, Jacobus Capitein. He lived only to the age of 30. He's the first ordained Protestant minister who's African in Protestant history. Right? He was the first ordained Protestant minister. He was a slave in Ghana who was captured, brought to the Netherlands, educated, and then went back. Had a very short 5 years before his untimely death. I'm going to begin my formal part of my talk by reading about 10 pages, so it should only last about 20 minutes, because I don't want to spend the whole time lecturing and not have enough time for questions or answers. So the life of Jacobus Capitein was a mere 30 years, from 1717 to 1747. Well, it was very short, but interest in him has been very long. When he arrived in Elmina, age 25, on a Dutch, there's Elmina Castle, which you can go to today. When he arrived in Elmina on a Dutch West Indies Company slave ship, he was an ordained Calvinist minister, an acclaimed graduate of Leiden University, one of the most famous Protestant universities in Europe at the time, and someone who had achieved a great deal of rapid fame, with his portraits circulated, poems published in his honor. These are some of his portraits that were, These are some of his portraits that were circulated at the time. Poems published in his honor, and a whole bunch of other forms of flattery and so forth. But Capitein, which is Dutch for captain was not his birth name, and of course the United Provinces or the Netherlands was not his birthplace. He was a former West African slave returning to his natal region when he disembarked on the shores of Elmina in 1742 when he was brought back. He was most likely Fonte, a prominent ethnicity among the Akan peoples of the Gold Coast, or what is today Ghana. What we know about his early life comes from the mention of it and the thing that made him famous, that secured his reputation, and that is this, a thesis. Now you see the Dutch translation, not the Latin original, delivered publicly and then published at Leiden University. Excuse me, hold on a second. Published at Leiden University. The title of the dissertation was Political Theological Dissertation, examining the question, is slavery compatible with Christian freedom or not? In which he argued for the compatibility of human bondage and evangelical freedom. In other words, for the moral permissibility of slavery. What we know about his childhood is very little. He relates that a slaver, Steinhardt, gifted him to a slave trader, Jacob van Quaque, and that he received the name captain in the honor of Steinham's profession. So Steinham kept Capitein as a young boy for about 3 years in Elmina Castle here, and then both returned to the Netherlands. Once established in the United Provinces after his arrival at Middelburg in 1728, Capitein embarked on years of dedicated study in The Hague and Leiden in very, very strict Calvinist circles. Heavily patronized by a very tight circle of this man's family and Calvinist ministers, theologians, and teachers, he had been preparing for years before his arrival back to the Gold Coast for both ministry and missionary work. Now, he's a very singular figure in the 18th century Dutch world. His short-lived celebrity hinged on his status as an African-born Calvinist minister, a theologian, the first African ordained Protestant minister in Protestant history, and a missionary. Yet as a figure, and this is very, very important, he was not unique in either Europe or North America of his era. To the contrary, he was part of a very small, remarkable circle of 18th century African and Euro-American figures who gained prominence in the universities and mission societies of Protestant Northern Europe and British North America. In the longer version of this paper, I mentioned 4. The Ghanaian philosopher Anton Amo to the left, who got a PhD in philosophy in Wittenberg, Germany in the 18th century. He went on to a teaching career before his career spectacularly fell apart, and he went back to the west coast of Africa. Then you have Christian Protten on the right, who's African-European, who became a very important Moravian missionary, and actually was in Elmina slightly before my figure. Capitein was in Elmina trying to set up a school there. He failed at that. But there's also at the same time, of course, Phillis Wheatley, very well known in the United States for her 18th century book of poetry, and for whom there's a beautiful new biography by David Waldstreicher, and also Philip Quaque. We don't have an image of him. His Life and Letters were published recently by the University of Georgia Press, and he was the first African-Anglican missionary, also in Ghana, but through the London Missionary Society. And he's very, very close to Capitein. So I try to look at comparing these folks to Capitein himself. But there's also several hundred black and indigenous Christian preachers in the 18th century world, studied by scholars like James Axel and Edward Andrews. Of all these figures, Capitein is probably the most unfathomable to us, with whom to reckon because of his seemingly unassailable, fixed religious and political conservatism. Now, what has been written about him? The secondary literature is very limited. The body of work reveals very shifting interpretations of his short life. The older studies, you're not going to be surprised to hear this, have traditionally read him as under the sway of powerful Calvinist ministers and West African company patrons, and a vehicle for their political and intellectual and economic interests. Certainly who's the tool of his mentor. While this point is obvious, to me it's limiting as well, foreclosing any sense of Capitein's own self and purpose. Now, in more recent years, there's been a 180 in scholarship on him. There have been a new interest of him, both within the Netherlands, which is having his Black Lives Matter moment now. So latecomers to that, that's part of the reason for this conference in New York, but there's a lot going on in the Netherlands too, decolonizing museums and a bunch of other things. So why the point is, so in more recent years, with a new interest in him both within the Netherlands and by scholars of the Black Atlantic world and early modern Africa more generally. The Ghanaian scholar of African religion, David Kofi, has argued that a Fonte-born 18th-century African, Capitein had familiarity with indigenous forms of Gold Coast slavery, which may have shaped his tolerance of the practice as much as any European or Dutch educational formation. It's interesting coming from a Ghanaian scholar, right? Christine Levesque has observed that his international profile and his bicultural identity as African and Dutch endows him with the status of an Atlantic world cosmopolitan, deepening his complexity and intellectual thought. This is a point being made now by a few other scholars too. All of these revisionist interpretations of him are indebted to the Ghanaian scholar David Anu Kopi, who consideration of Capitein positioned him theologically as a bicultural African, seeing as a member of kind of the black intellectual, black Atlantic world, right? As a cosmopolitan of the black Atlantic world. But such an interpretation runs a risk of deracinating too much from his Dutch Calvinist formation, and indeed the Dutchness of his life, or even the Calvinist isn't of his life. It's the dislocating foreignness to us of his actions and thoughts that I want to highlight, while asking what in the Dutch and Gold Coast 18th century context, both in West Africa and in Europe, might open the doors to ways of getting at him, his bicultural and multivocal viewpoints, especially through Dutch history, Calvinist religion, and West African cultural and religious context. So that's the larger purpose, is to read him as a much more complex figure than any of the kind of recent literature or previous literature has done. So the larger paper focuses on two things. First, his immersion in the context of modern Dutch history, and then the second, the remarkable tensions upon his return to Elmina between his failed efforts to serve as a minister and religious educator to local families, and there was a failure, and his notable determination, met with unanticipated criticism in the Netherlands, to translate 3 short religious texts into the African language of Fonte. So let's take a look at what happened when he got to Elmina at the age of 25. When Capitein arrived in Elmina on October 7, 1742, he did so fast on the heels of a year of intense celebrity in the Netherlands. A period of acclaim following the publication, 5 editions of his thesis in Dutch in 1 year, and the publication of his original Latin dissertation too. And his ordination only a few months later as a Calvinist minister on May 7, 1742 in Amsterdam. Within a very short period, Capitein became the subjects of praise poems, portraits, the author of published or soon to be published, served as a kind of black exhibit for the 18th century Dutch intellectual class and religious class as well. And yet, when he got to Elmina, few knew him. Among the 241 West Indies Company's Dutch employees on the Gold Coast that same year, about 107 European men staffed Elmina Castle, with a number of other mixed-race employees alongside them in various more basic roles, the offspring of relations between Dutch male employees or other European male employees and local African women, a social sexual practice known by the Portuguese term caliçao. While the Dutch Gold Coast Africans, European traders, slavers, and mixed-race men and women had by the middle of the 18th century long ties and threads of relations, social, sexual, political, commercial, Capitein would nevertheless present to these various communities as a very surprising figure. For here was an African-born young adult of Fonte ethnicity as an official of the West Indies Company who arrived on a Dutch slave ship to Elmina, a site where captured Africans were held in underground pens awaiting their Middle Passage fate. As odd as that might have been, even more so was Capitein's credentials as a newly appointed Calvinist minister to the European community, the second highest paid position at Elmina Castle. And his name, Capitein, of course, or captain, bespoke Dutch colonial power and the very slave trade itself. Curiously, as Capitein moved from an academic consideration of slavery in the Netherlands for his formal academic training and the writing of his thesis, to the immersion in the West African world of the slave trade, he actually never made mention of slavery again in his letters and reports back to his superiors in the Netherlands, even though it was his written thesis about the topic that had secured his reputation. Now, this is certainly because Capitein's focus turned sharply from religious and academic study to the work of ministry, and to the school directorship to local Elmina children he was supposed to move forward with. But it may also be because, in his own mind, the issue of slavery was not only theologically, but historically a resolved matter in the Netherlands of the 18th century. Now this gets a little wonky because this is more the history part, and I don't want to dwell on what's happening in the Netherlands in the 18th century. What are debates about slavery? What are the Dutch's roles in the slave trade? We don't need to get into too great depth about this. So to me, if you look at his thesis, and look at the arguments about why evangelical freedom, why Christian freedom is not incompatible with actual bondage, physical bondage. The theological and classical sources he uses for the justification for slavery and his thesis are very, very well known. And we can talk about what those arguments are, but you're going to find them very familiar if you know any of the pro-slavery arguments from the 18th century. But his arguments for the disappearance of slavery and the United Provinces are less well known, and nobody's quite paid attention to them. So while Capitein recognized slavery as compatible with evangelical freedom, he also likewise noticed slavery didn't exist in the Netherlands. Now, to highlight that the Dutch prized freedom, and Republican freedom, and citizenship in a thesis on the compatibility of slavery and evangelical freedom might seem puzzling. But to Capitein, the point about Dutch liberty, a term very important in their revolt against Spain and the kind of political liturgy that was developed and the imagery that was developed in the revolt against Spanish imperialism, that the Dutch were simultaneously engaged in as they were building a colonial empire, it was crucial because he was highlighting, therefore, that the Dutch were a community of Republican citizens. And that was not why he was defending the compatibility of slavery with evangelical freedom, because it didn't exist in the Netherlands. The United Provinces did not permit slavery, not because of Calvinism, or not because of any theological conflict between evangelical freedom and human bondage, but rather because slavery itself was antithetical to Dutch notions of freedom and republicanism, its citizen patriot political formation. The Dutch abjured slavery at home precisely because they gained their freedom from the Spanish Habsburgs with their own prolonged 80-year war. So while Capitein does not dwell on this historical assertion at length, he does cunningly note that while the Dutch practiced manumission of slaves, so if you were a slave and you brought the Netherlands, the minute it's called the free soil principle in the United States, the minute you touched soil, you were manumitted, because slavery was incompatible with Republican notions of citizenship. Now, it wasn't that simple. I'm happy to go over cases where people had petitioned for their freedom, but it is true they had metropolitan manumission, it's called. While Capitein notes that the Dutch practices, he cunningly notes that the Portuguese and Spanish did not. This was an obvious dig at his Iberian enemies from whom the Dutch had fought their protracted war. Okay, so Capitein only mentions slavery once in his 5 years in Elmina before he dies. And he mentioned it in the inaugural sermon he gave as the minister of Elmina Castle on October 21st, 1742, with the title of the sermon, which was printed back in the Netherlands. I'm sure this is scintillating. You're going to read it tonight, right? You can't wait to get your hands on it. The great light of God's grace is observed in his servants within the ministry of grace. In this sermon, he thanks his patrons in the Netherlands and restates his gratitude that he was taken out of quote-unquote bodily slavery to blessed free Holland, but also observed that he had made a commitment upon becoming a Christian that one day he would return to his father's house in peace if the Lord blessed him with salvation. So Capitein's inaugural sermon in Elmina Castle, which is holding hundreds of slaves, right, underneath the main floors, reference his life course from slavery to freedom, from quote-unquote heathen darkness to political freedom and religious salvation. As such, it's personal, and it's eschatological. His language was Dutch, and his references were almost entirely scriptural when they were not biographical. In the matriarchal society of the Fonte, and the broader Akan communities of West Africa, Capitein speaks not of his return to his motherland, but to his father's house, whether by that he means his biological father and his land, or the Lord, his Christian father, if not both. Both, however, reveal emphatically his Dutchness, his deeply felt Calvinism, his language, his attachment to the metropole, his ministerial authority to evangelize, and his prizing over the father over the mother, the patrilinear over the matrilinear. Saidiya Hartman, as you know, many of you are familiar with her work, upon her visit to Ghana, Elmina, over the course of 2 research residencies in the late 90s, entitled her memoir, Lose Your Mother, which is mine, is lose your fatherland, right? It's a play on her. It's a reference to the heavily plied letters written by young Ghanaian boys and their verbal exhortations not to lose your mother or your motherland, with which they routinely greeted black American visitors who visited the Elmina Castle on heritage tours, which are very, very popular today, seeking pen pals and financial and familial support. In a very, very different time, yet in precisely the same place, Capitein understood his voyage and longing differently. He was returning home to affirm his vaterland, as you say in the Netherlands, the United Provinces, while seeking to re-engage through missionary work his natal homeland, or in the words of his first sermon on Elmina, his father's house. But therein lay the problems. Capitein's 4.5 years in Elmina before his untimely death have been routinely described as a series of failures. Okay, true, his ministerial work at Elmina Castle went poorly. Let me kind of put it in a non-academic vernacular. There were 2 problems. The first, I grew up in the South. The first was what we would call down south, preacher man problem, right? A devout Calvinist could have little luck among the West India Company's employees, who are largely unchurched and not exactly the pious types. There's a saying that south of the equator, the 10 Commandments don't apply. All right. Second, let's face it, he was black and in a position of authority, which wasn't well received by his supposed congregants. What is more, when he looked at the church records in Elmina Castle, he was appalled to learn, based on attendance and baptismal records, that past ministry work was largely a failure. Poor attendance, spotty activity, and what is worse to him, the baptism of illegitimate mixed-race children who were raised not by the European fathers, but instead by their African mothers. Capitein was despondent, realizing that, like his predecessors, he could not carry out the ministry work in the face of, quote, the hatred, contempt, persecution, and menace of most of the depraved Christians at this castle. This stung especially for him because he had earlier requested to marry a local African woman, but he was denied by the Calvinist consistory in Amsterdam, and on the basis that she was not a baptized Christian, so they sent him instead a Dutch wife. But he's surrounded by all these men having these relationships with local African women, and seeing that these kids got baptized by previous ministers and so forth and so on. Now, what is not so true, and this is the way I'll finish up, and then we can have a conversation here, is that his other work to instruct the children, both of the employees, and many of these children almost all of them were mixed race, and local Elminans in that community. Elmina was a community of about 6,000 to 8,000 Africans of various ethnicities, and literacy and religion, that was more successful. To the contrary, Capitein, and his letters are an indication, was inspired by this work with children. When he arrived in Elmina, there was a Dutch language school and a schoolmaster, but only about 15 children, mostly, again, mixed-race employees and a few European kids, but not many. But Capitein managed to really build out this missionary school and emphasize new forms of religious instruction. Apart from teaching reading and the alphabet, Capitein emphasized religious instruction, teaching the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. Elminians were largely suspicious, if not downright hostile to this elementary school education, and despite this, Capitein managed to grow the school to 50 children. He penned enthusiastic reports to his bosses in Amsterdam about the progress and requested educational and religious materials for his support. Lesson books on grammars and writing, visual religious texts, biblical stories, and other support material. Capitein's effort did not go without notice. The king of the Asante, which was a large interior empire, not a coastal empire, interior empire, the king of the Asante actually requested 12 Asante boys and girls to be sent to the Netherlands for formal education on the basis of what they heard about Capitein's instructions, but that request was denied, and instead they were sent to Capitein himself to educate in his school. Now, the school and ministerial outreach depended on preparing instructional materials. His efforts were pioneering in this regard for Calvinism and Protestantism in West Africa. He prepared translations in Fonte, which he relearned. He relearned his native language, which he had forgotten. Unlike Quaque, the England missionary who was many more decades in West Africa, never really successfully apparently relearned his native language, whereas Capitein clearly reached a kind of level of command. If maybe he had remembered it, he had come at the age of 12, so he might have remembered quite a bit. He was clearly re-engaged his local language. His translation not only depended on reacquisition of it, it depended on preparing translations of religious texts, especially the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. He sent these translations to be published in the Netherlands, and they were, but his editor actually included a preface to the translations saying, I think there's problems with these translations. So he was actually criticized by his own publisher with the translations. So there was two prefaces to the translations, one by Capitein saying these are my translations into Fonte from Dutch, and the second from his publisher, who noticed while the translations might have been hard, there were errors, which he gleaned not by reading Fonte, of course, which he couldn't read, but because Capitein actually provided literal Dutch translations of his Fonte translations. Okay, so his editor was particularly struck by Capitein's rendering of the fourth commandment and the Ten Commandments, which omitted the prohibition of a servant working on the Sabbath by deleting the word servant in Fonte. And the editor noticed he used the word servant in the 10th commandment, but deleted it in the 4th commandment. This selective omission was likely an accommodation to the West Indies Company and the Dutch slave interests, a slight adjustment so as not to offend slave owners and their brutal labor regimes. But to read, this is my point, to read his work as entirely compromised by a single cautious maneuver, or to see the broader challenge as merely one of mechanically finding the appropriate substitute for an unknown word like donkey with the Fonte word, would be to miss much of the overall effort. For as the Ghanaian theologian Don Kavuna-Ekem has noted in an overlooked short essay on this translation work, Capitein was a pioneer figure in what he called the mother tongue biblical hermeneutics field, one sensitive to the religious and cultural dynamics of the Gold Coast and Fonte people, and one shaped by smart translation choices to reflect these sensibilities. To Ekem, Capitein was actually a skilled interpreter of the Fonte worldview, and therefore a pivotal figure in indigenizing Christianity to African idioms. As Ekem points out in a very detailed consideration of the Fonte rendering of the Apostles' Creed, Capitein in several instances strove to accommodate African and spiritual and cultural worldviews into his translation. Let me just give a couple examples. For example, he rendered Father Almighty as Senior Father to better capture the familial language current to the Fonte, and which captures too how the Fonte deities are often cast in protective, paternal, and maternal terms. In Article 3 of the Apostles' Creed, to take another example, the Holy Ghost becomes the good ghost, more in line with Fonte vocabulary employed in reference to ancestor spirits, and therefore yet another example of a skilled awareness of African practices and worldviews. So in the arc of this man's short life, these three textual translations get almost no attention except by this one Ghanaian theologian. This is regrettable because these efforts, while short-circuited by his death, might have been among his most important legacies in the much larger history of Christianity in Africa. So to conclude, and then we can chat for a little bit. And by the way, these last two slides I meant to show you, there are about 100 to 150 documented Africans in 18th century Amsterdam. 17th, 18th century Amsterdam. This is a map by the archivist at City Archives of Amsterdam with some of these inhabitants. Many of these were former slaves or household servants bought by the Portuguese Sephardic community of Amsterdam. We don't have time to go into that. But Rembrandt got many of his models for the African or black figures in his artworks, and these are Rembrandt's sketches, from this community because he lived in that area of Amsterdam and he was able to secure male and female models from that community. So Jacobus Capitein, life was cut short and therefore easy to read as tragic alone. His abbreviated burst of fame, followed by disappointments and obstacles. Certainly, his European patrons and their assumptions failed him. His Calvinist ministers and theologians, just like his teachers, relatives, student friends, thought they were sending an African back to the Gold Coast under the paternalistic guise of a civilizing mission of a recently civilized young man. The report of what might have happened to him in his final year before his death makes evidence this kind of conceit of his supporters. A lore began that was sealed in the work of the French Abbé and had early abolitionists in France, Abbé Gregoire's short consideration of Capitein in a book he wrote about literature, La littérature des Nègres, the literature of blacks, 1808, that he theorized that Capitein was ultimately too African, that in the end he shed his Calvinism and his Dutchness to disavow his European commitments, to re-embrace the idolatry and amoralism of local folkways. So the kind of urban myth began that he abandoned Calvinism and he went back to indigenous, he re-indigenized and then went kind of disappeared. That was the thinking. Okay, because nobody knows exactly how he died. Okay, while what these European patrons and later observers failed to realize, that while Capitein was indeed African-born, he was fully Dutch in language, culture, and religion, a devout Calvinist and a product of the urban political culture and religious culture of The Hague and Leiden, in which he was educated and raised. Rejected by his fellow compatriots at Elmina Castle, and more broadly by the European community of traders and slavers, Capitein sought to bring Christianity to both the employees of the West India Company and the children of Elmina. In the process, let's think about it, he re-engaged Fonte as a language and introduced a Kan, or Fonte, sensibility to the religious text he translated and the people with whom he engaged. Fatherland was a key binding element of Dutch political culture in its early modern patriotic core. Captain's return to Elmina was a loosening of that political and cultural attachment. As he re-engaged his motherland, he lost his fatherland and died young, a bicultural go-between whose full contribution has never been, in fact, fully understood. His legacy is akin, to me, to the sad and brief mention of him in the archival records of the West Indies Company that I found. Just noted in passing and not commented on, noted in passing only, and rather than fully fleshed out and appreciated. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, comments?
Definitely do.
I have.
I have lots of questions, but one of them is, can you say anything about his dissertation, his original thing that made him famous? I mean, I know that's not really the point of what you're saying, but it feels like it's part of the story insofar as he was sort of rewarded
Yeah, I can say
for
a lot.
that, and then punished maybe for.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first. Well, first of all, let's contrast. Obviously, I don't have time. I didn't have time to go into the longer paper itself, but if you contrast, I don't know if I'm going to reopen the PowerPoint, but let's contrast him to his near contemporary of the people I mentioned, Anton Amo, the German philosopher, who was also brought by the Dutch West Indies Company to Europe, like Capitein. He ended up in Germany for reasons I won't go into, ended up not going into theology, but philosophy. Anton was a lot of interest in him now in the field of philosophy, the republishing of the body of his work and so forth. Anton, who was a near contemporary, wrote a master's thesis, which was orally delivered, arguing that sub-Saharan Africans could not be enslaved because, so the exact opposite are, because they had been enfeoffed by the Roman Empire. And because, which is true, Rome had, parts of Africa, not so much West Africa, but because they were enfeoffed as subjects of the Roman Empire, they had the rights of Roman law that still protected them. So he made that. Capitein makes an utterly different argument. So I have read the thesis very carefully, and there's a good translation of it done by a classicist at Stanford who's African. So he was very interested in who is this African, writing a Latin thesis defending evangelical freedom as incompatible, as compatible with bondage. The thesis works through, obviously, the core theological religious arguments of his mentors, because that's what thesis. If you don't know this, in the early modern period in Europe, up until the 19th century, if you wrote a thesis, originality was not the point. The German research university, you replicated your professor's work. And often you read your professor's work for the thesis. You actually didn't write your own thesis, you read your faculty's work. So originality was never the point. It looks like Capitein probably wrote this himself, from what we guess, but it's all based on the standard argument, pro-slavery arguments of the 18th century. But if you look very carefully at it, somebody said, is this a thesis defending slavery? In a very, you can read it yourself, in a very, very technical sense, no. He's not defending slavery in a very strict sense. He's saying slavery is not incompatible with Christianity. That's not the same argument as saying that slavery is morally permissible. I use that term, but he's not making a justification for slavery. He's justifying the ability to Christianize slaves. He's making an argument for the compatibility of Christianity and slavery among slaves. And many, as you know, the history of the slave trade and Christian missionaries, many of the slavers, many of the plantation owners did not want Moravian, Protestant, Catholic, or other missionaries around them because they worried about the kind of message of freedom that was associated with Christianity, Christian theological core. So there's nothing original about the thesis in an 18th century sense, except for the kind of curiosity of a West African writing this work and gaining a kind of short-lived celebrity and then being ordained and sent to West Africa. That's exactly what they do with Philip Quaque 20 years later in London. He goes to Ghana. He stays for 40 years. And you can read all this. He had many of the same experiences as Capitein. The difference is, well, there's a lot of differences because the abolition movement begins by that period. And so Quaque becomes an abolitionist in a way Capitein never did because he didn't know about abolition. That political movement had not begun in either North America or Europe by the time he had died.
So, Peter, you said something about translations into Fante. But then were they suppressed? I may have missed that point.
Yeah, I jammed through that. No, they weren't suppressed. He translated these texts, they were published, sent back, but the preface to the book says these translations are problematic.
Translations into Fante.
Were problematic. The publisher looks at, because what Capitein says, I published these in Fante, but I want you, my Dutch publisher, to understand exactly what is being said in Fante. So I'm going to translate it exactly back into Dutch, so you can see the difference between the Dutch original and the Fante version. I'm translating back into Dutch.
And what was the motivation for that suspicion of the translation? Why would there have been a concern about the quality or the accuracy of the translations. And that
It's puzzling, right? I mean, because this was the same publisher who published his thesis and his dissertation, but he was remarkably critical of the translations.
And the Fonte was meant to circulate.
Circulate among the children, among the children, as a tool to acquire Christianity, because they struggled with European languages.
Is there research on the Fonte documents to sort of think about how is somebody reading those now? No.
Nobody looks at this stuff.
Are they available?
Yeah. There's one. I've looked at it. There's one copy left in the Netherlands. It's not digitized, right?
I'm thinking of the whole history of Bible and Christian material translation into English.
Right. Yeah. Craig knows a lot about this, I'm sure, for the English case, but he's early. We're only decades away from vigorous translations of the full London Missionary Society. You know this from Tahiti, you know this from the Pacific, you know this from the Atlantic world. Christian missionaries in Africa preceded him, of course. First Christian missionaries, of course, were the Jesuits, coming with the Portuguese. You had the Kingdom of Congo, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Christianity was indigenous to Africa, right? Ethiopia. Right? Never was a Christian kingdom that was never conquered, never colonized by a European. Yeah. Is it really, if you've ever read the Hawaiian Bible, I know Craig's read the Hawaiian Bible, you can see, I love the Hawaiian Bible, the Biblic, because you can see the kind of intellectual work it takes to translate, this canonical religious text with an indigenous sensibility. And the kind of things he was struggling with in Fonte, you see in the Bible, the Hawaiian Bible as well. You see in other translated versions of the Bible.
Great, this is right. They were going back to the original languages of the Bible, the Hawaiian translators, yeah.
It's complicated. That's
Capali's
Capali's argument, and they were trained by the foremost. They were trained by the foremost classical scholars who were doing the new criticism in early 19th century America, but they were also really young undergraduates. So basically it was like 18 months of doing Hebrew or whatever. But you do pick up people like Lyons over on Hawaii Island. We'll talk about consulting the Hebrew and whatever when he's doing what he's doing. So Capali argues very strongly that the thing that's always for me a question though is, because these are young missionaries who grew up on the east coast of the United States, is one of my teachers in Victorian literature. I once asked him, what's the foreign language that you need to know most if you're going to do Victorian 19th century literature? He just looked at me and said, the language of the King James Bible. That would have been the ground for everything, and that the translation, even if it was drawing on all that new critical stuff, would still be, and you can track it next to the King James Bible all the way through. And that follows up, actually that was the question I was going to go to, because what happened here was initially what they thought they were going to do was teach Hawaiians English, and then they'd be able to read the Bible. And within a very short period of time, they realized, no, they're really not interested in that, but they're intensely interested in literacy. Therefore, we got to go the other way around. And within 18 years, they put the entire Bible. And of course, everybody, the common stuff on this is, so it's Protestants, and direct access to the Bible is a cardinal aspect of faith as opposed to Catholic, et cetera, et cetera. I was just wondering, is that coming up in the material that you're looking at here? I mean, was there a sense that what he was trying to do was in some ways inculcate literacy above all, because it would provide access to theology?
The goal was both to serve as a minister to the men who, and they were all men, who worked in the slave trade business, Elmina Castle, and the other commercial side of things too, other than human bondage. They were trading a bunch of other things too. And at the same time, bring Dutch language and Calvinism to the broader Elmina community, the African town of Elmina. But he failed. I mean, he translated these religious texts. He more than doubled the size of the school, but he died so young. If you look at Philip Quaque, 2 decades later, same proposition. They brought 3 African young boys from the Gold Coast to London. 2 died, 1 survived, ordained Anglican minister, went back to Ghana, lived for you can read his letters, lived for 40 years. All right, so I've been comparing him to Capitein's letters. Quaque was like, Quaque is just an extended version of Capitein. He never succeeds. He never succeeds. Many of the same frustrations, many of the same challenges. You know, these ruffians who, you know, all they want to do is cohabitate with African women and drink. And they have no interest in attending service or catechism, or they don't want to join a consistory. They don't want to do any of this stuff. And at the same time feeling rejected at the same time by the Africans from whom he came and who was trying to serve. So he also built a school, and it never really took off.
So there was never any point where the African chiefs or whatever were actually embracing literacy or actively encouraging that instruction?
Where they were, they wanted to send the Asantes, which was the biggest state, and wanted their kids sent to Europe for a formal education, more than anything else. They saw the advantage of that, literacy, you know, contacts, power, prestige, but they were often refused and told to stay local and be taught by these missionaries. Okay. So the 18th century missionary, West African Protestant missionaries were not successful. Success came later. And you know, today Africa and Latin America are the 2 great wellsprings of global Christianity. Far more than North America or Europe or the Middle East is really Latin America and Africa. I mean, if you go to Rome, well, I was in Rome 3 years ago, Vatican's full of non-European priests and nuns, right? Filipinos, Mexicans, West Africans, you name it.
Argentinians.
Yeah, you name it. And of course, I attended a Nigerian Catholic church for 2 years, and it was devoutly Christian. I can remember that for sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot more fun going to church here, but.
Different figure, different period, but I can't help but think of the story of Henry Obukahi, who, you know who I mean? He died in 1819. The story, yeah.
Obukahi.
Is that how you say it?
Henele Obukahi.
Oh, yes, yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it right. But anyway, there's a sort of a apocryphal story, I'm sure, at Yale Divinity School that Henry shows up, is found on the steps of Yale Divinity School, crying and begging for a Christian education.
Yeah, that's a
and he is seminary trained. Yeah, he is seminary trained, but he actually dies. They refuse to ordain him, and he actually dies in Connecticut. So his story is
the timing there was really tight because they were actually getting ready to send those young men back, and they did send a number of the young men back. The thing is that he ended up writing an autobiography and started trying to translate the Bible and then died young. But they used that, actually. Yeah. That was the great incentive for sending the first missionary company.
His story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were translating that. That's the other thing. That was one of the first things they were translating into the Hawaiian language was his English autobiography.
What's interesting about Captain, we call him Captain in English. What's interesting about Captain is that Quaque was brought by the Anglicans to be a minister. That was the goal. Capitein was just brought by his slave adopted father, slave back to the Netherlands, and was put into catechism classes, and he excelled. That's what, if you read, I don't have time, he just was the best student in class. I thought, this guy, this African boy, is the best theology student in The Hague. So they put him on scholarship and sent him to Leiden University, which is a great Protestant university of the 17th, 18th century, where he also excelled. He studied Greek, he studied Latin, he studied Hebrew, he was ordained, he was very talented, and very well, and there's all these praise poems to him, and there's a whole lot of material about him when he was a student and when he was a young minister. And then what we have is only the 5 years of letters once he goes back to Africa. Now, I've read them all, but it's not a huge, it's about 35 letters, it's not 100 letters. Yeah, Joseph.
Hey, look, there was church service in Africa.
Was that?
The church service.
Yeah.
Were they in Dutch or were they in...
And at the castle itself, Elmina, yeah, they were in Dutch. In the school, he was teaching literacy and these texts, which he obviously was teaching in Fonte, which is why he translated them, because he must have realized these young men and women, these young men, young African men, Elmina men, who are not going to learn this European language. The lingua franca of this whole area was Portuguese. So everybody working in this area, whether they're Swiss, Norwegian, English, the lingua franca of the slave trade on the West Coast was Portuguese. Everybody had to speak a Creole version of Portuguese. And this notion of cohabitation created, I'm not an 18th century Africanist, but what I found fascinating reading the social and cultural historians is this incredible world of Afro-European men and women because of this enormous set of relationships that developed between the European male workers, many of whom weren't Dutch. They were German or they're the international proletariat. And their casual relationships with African women, and then the children are raised not among the men, but among the women and their families. So there was this whole network. Within 50 years, hundreds and hundreds of families of these European African go-betweens who worked as middlemen in trade, they worked as guards at the fort because they were bicultural. They could speak both Fonte and Dutch, many of them, and they knew both worlds. But they stayed in West, they did not go to Europe, they stayed in West Africa. If you look at some of the elite Ghanaian families today, many of them are descendants of these Afro-European products of the Portuguese caliçaren, or cohabitation practice.
Which is the same thing that happened in Ceylon or Sri
Sure,
Lanka.
right, yeah.
The Andache.
It's the social product of colonialism, obviously. Imperialism and colonialism.
And on that cheery note, I'd like to ask everybody to join me in thanking Peter.
Thank you,
for
guys.
stimulating talk.